The summer of 1874, a column of nearly 1,000 soldiers moved southwest out of Fort Abraham Lincoln in present-day North Dakota, trailing supply wagons, a 16-piece band, and 2 civilian miners whose presence on the expedition manifest was never formally explained in any official order. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led the column. The destination was the Black Hills, Paha Sapa, a pine-covered granite range rising sharply out of the Great Plains of what is now western South Dakota. The column entered territory the United States government had formally guaranteed to the Lakota Sioux 6 years earlier under the Treaty of Fort Laramie. The guarantee was specific, written into ratified law, registered with the Senate. The Black Hills would remain closed to all white settlement permanently, held by the Lakota people as long as the grass grows and the water flows. That was the language the government signed. The column moved south anyway. By August, Custer's geologist had confirmed traces of gold in the creek beds. Custer dispatched a rider 400 miles north to the nearest telegraph station. The message he carried announced gold among the roots of the grass. It was printed in newspapers across the country within days. What followed erased a world. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Lakota had known the Black Hills across a span of time that no military column passing through in a summer could have measured. The Sioux Nation arrived in the region in the early 18th century, moving west from the Great Lakes under pressure from eastern tribes and the expanding colonial frontier. But the hills themselves carried a significance that preceded even Lakota presence. The formation of granite peaks and pine valleys had been a site of gathering, ceremony, and passage for indigenous peoples across a far longer span of time than the written record of the United States accounts for. The Lakota called them Paha Sapa, a phrase meaning hills that are black, for the way the dark pine canopy reads against the surrounding short grass prairie at a distance. The name described the visual fact and pointed towards something older. The hills were not simply territory in the Lakota understanding of land. They were the center of the world, a place of vision quests, of ceremony, of the passage between the living and the dead. The Lakota understood Paha Sapa as the place from which the people had emerged and to which the people would return. That understanding shaped every practical relationship the Lakota had with the land. The hills fed the people through harsh winters. Elk, deer, and bison sheltered in the protected valleys when the open plains became impassable in the cold months, and hunters who knew the terrain could find game when the surrounding grassland offered nothing. The timber provided lodge poles and fuel. The springs ran year-round when the creeks on the plains dried. Medicinal plants grew along the creek beds. The geography of the hills, their elevation, their protection from wind, their reliable water sources, made them a refuge in both the practical and the spiritual sense, and the Lakota who lived in and around them understood their value with a precision that came from generations of dependence. Paha Sapa was not a spiritual abstraction held apart from practical life. It was the material and ceremonial foundation of an entire civilization, and the Lakota who maintained that relationship with it had been clear, in every negotiation with the United States government, that the hills held a category of significance that the government's treaty framework had no real language for. The geology of the Black Hills is itself a record of duration that makes the events of the 1870s look very recent. The core of the hills is Precambrian granite, some of it close to 2 billion years old, pushed up through overlying sedimentary rock by tectonic forces long before anything that walks or speaks existed on the continent. The ring of younger sedimentary formations that surrounds the granite core, limestone, sandstone, shale laid down in ancient seas, contains the fossils of marine creatures from the Cretaceous period, when a shallow inland sea covered much of what is now the American interior. The Black Hills rise above the surrounding plains by as much as 4,000 feet at their highest point, Harney Peak, which the Lakota call Hinhankaga, Owlmaker, and which is the highest point east of the Rockies in North America. The streams that flow down from the hills are fed by snowmelt and rain captured at elevation, and they run year-round in a region where surface water is otherwise scarce. The gold that Custer's geologist confirmed in 1874 had been deposited in the rock by hydrothermal processes hundreds of millions of years ago, carried in solution through fractures in the granite by superheated water forced upward from great depth. The Lakota did not need a geologist to tell them the gold was there. The streams had been carrying fine particles of it for as long as anyone had watched the streams. When the United States government sent surveyors and treaty commissioners into Lakota territory across the 1860s, the question of the Black Hills came up in council after council. Lakota leaders consistently identified the hills as non-negotiable. They were not part of the general territory that could be traded or ceded in exchange for annuities and promises. They held a different status, and the leaders who spoke about them in those proceedings were not making a bargaining position. They were describing a relationship that they regarded as permanent and that they expected the government to treat as permanent. This position was recorded in the proceedings of multiple councils during the period. The men representing the government wrote it down. They understood the distinction the Lakota were drawing. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 was signed in that context, and it reflected, more clearly than any prior agreement, the Lakota position on the hills. The 1868 treaty was not the first agreement between the United States and the Sioux Nation, but it was the most explicit, and it came from a Lakota military victory that the government could not ignore. Red Cloud's War had begun 2 years earlier, in direct response to the Bozeman Trail, which cut through Sioux hunting grounds in present-day Wyoming and Montana to reach the goldfields further west. The Army had built a series of forts along the trail to keep it open for mining and emigrant traffic. Red Cloud and the Lakota spent 2 years making those forts untenable, attacking supply lines, disrupting communication, and trapping soldiers behind their own stockades. One engagement, the Fetterman Fight in December of 1866, killed 80 soldiers in a single afternoon, the largest loss the Army had suffered at Lakota hands to that point. The government eventually withdrew its forces. The forts were abandoned and burned by the Lakota within days of evacuation. The treaty that followed reflected that outcome without ambiguity. The United States acknowledged Lakota sovereignty over a vast territory including the Black Hills. The government pledged that no person, civilian or military, would be permitted to settle in or pass through the territory without Lakota consent. Article 16 of the treaty prohibited citizens of the United States from settling in, occupying, or passing through the unceded Indian Territory to the north and west. There was no ambiguity in the document, and both parties understood what they were agreeing to. The government agreed because it had lost, and because the political cost of continuing the war was higher than the cost of the promise. What the Army sent into that territory 6 years later was not an exploratory survey in any neutral sense. The official purpose of the 1874 expedition was to scout a possible location for a military post and to evaluate the region's general resources. But Custer's column had carried those 2 civilian miners since it departed Fort Lincoln, and their presence on a military expedition into legally protected Lakota territory was never formally accounted for in the official record. The Black Hills had been the subject of persistent rumors in the years following the treaty, rumors drawn largely from Lakota accounts which described gold in the streams and yellow metal in the surrounding rock. The government sent the column to confirm what the Lakota had already described. The confirmation, when it came, was transmitted with speed and with language designed for publication. The dispatches were written for the papers, and they produced exactly the result that language of that kind was designed to produce. Within months, prospectors were moving toward the Black Hills from every direction, and the treaty that prohibited their entry was already ceasing to function as a practical constraint. Lakota leaders understood immediately what the announcement would set in motion. Sitting Bull, whose authority among the non-treaty Lakota was both established and deeply held, had refused to sign the 1868 treaty, and had refused every subsequent accommodation with the government's expanding presence in the region. He described the Black Hills as the food pack of the people, the place that sustained life across seasons and generations, the place that could not be traded without trading the people's future. His position was not a political stance. It was a statement about what the relationship between the Lakota and the land required. Red Cloud, who had signed the treaty and moved his people to the Red Cloud Agency in Nebraska, sent formal protests to Washington through the official channels that remained available to him. Spotted Tail, whose agency was in what is now southwestern Nebraska, did the same. Their objections were recorded, forwarded through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and set aside. The government's first response to the gold confirmation was to attempt a purchase. A commission arrived in the fall of 1875 to negotiate with Lakota leadership. The council that followed was attended by thousands of Lakota from multiple bands, and the outcome was the same across all of them. The Lakota refused to sell at any price. Red Cloud reportedly told the commissioners that if the government wanted the hills, it would need to pay enough to support the Lakota people for 7 generations. The commission returned to Washington empty-handed. What the government did next was not to honor the treaty it had signed. It issued a winter ultimatum ordering all non-treaty Lakota to report to Reservation Agency headquarters by the end of January 1876, a deadline that required bands scattered across hundreds of miles of winter terrain to relocate in weeks, through conditions that made movement across open plains in January nearly impossible. When the bands did not comply, the army declared them hostile and launched a campaign. The campaign produced its most documented moment at the Little Bighorn River in June of 1876, where Custer's immediate command was destroyed in a single afternoon by a force of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors that had gathered in numbers the army had not anticipated. Sitting Bull had led the sun dance that preceded the battle and had received a vision of soldiers falling headfirst from the sky. The battle confirmed the vision, but the battle was not an ending. It was a moment inside a longer process. The army returned with reinforced columns through the following winter. By the spring of 1877, most of the non-treaty bands had been forced onto reservations. Crazy Horse surrendered in May of that year at Fort Robinson in Nebraska and was killed there in September, in a confrontation that remains disputed as to who gave which order. Sitting Bull eventually fled to Canada with a portion of his followers, returning in 1881 to surrender at Fort Buford. The military phase of the dispossession was complete. The gold rush that Custer's dispatch triggered did not wait for any of those events to resolve. By the summer of 1875, thousands of prospectors were already in the Black Hills in direct violation of the treaty. The army was formally ordered to remove them. Officers turned miners back at the edges of the hills and watched them circle around and re-enter from a different direction within days. General Philip Sheridan wrote in correspondence that he could not enforce the exclusion clause without stationing a soldier behind every tree in the Black Hills. The government did not provide those soldiers. The prospectors who moved through named their camps Custer City and Deadwood and began pulling gold from the streams while the treaty prohibiting their presence remained technically in force. The United States ratified the formal transfer of the Black Hills in 1877 through a new agreement that the 1868 treaty's own provisions required to be signed by 3/4 of all adult Lakota males. The 1877 document obtained nothing approaching that threshold. It was signed under military pressure by a portion of the leadership, with the campaign against the non-treaty bands still ongoing and Crazy Horse not yet surrendered. Congress ratified it anyway. The legal irregularities were noted in some of the congressional debate and then set aside. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What the Black Hills produced in the following decades was substantial. The Homestake Mine, established at Lead, South Dakota, in 1876 by a syndicate that eventually came to include George Hearst, became the largest and deepest gold mine in North American history. It operated continuously for 125 years, closing in 2002. Total gold extracted over that span exceeded 40 million troy ounces. The mine employed thousands of workers across multiple generations, paying wages and building communities, while the Lakota, whose treaty land it occupied, received nothing from the extraction. The town of Lead grew around the mine's headframe. Deadwood, a few miles away, became one of the most documented boomtowns of the American West. a place where Wild Bill Hickok was shot at a card table in 1876, and Calamity Jane became a figure large enough to survive into legend. The infrastructure built to support the extraction spread across the hills and tied them into national supply chains. The rail lines and smelters and power systems that went in to serve the mines also served to make the Black Hills permanently part of the settled American West, a region whose economy and identity were built on a foundation the treaty said could not be laid. All of it rested on ground the United States had formally promised would remain Lakota. None of the proceeds reached the people whose land it had been. The Lakota legal challenge to that dispossession went on for generations before it reached federal courts in a form that could produce a ruling. The Indian Claims Commission, established by Congress in 1946 to adjudicate tribal grievances against the federal government, took up the Black Hills case after years of effort by Lakota lawyers and advocates who had been working the problem since the 1920s. The legal proceedings generated thousands of pages of testimony, historical analysis, and economic argument across 3 decades. The Commission found in the Lakotas' favor in 1974, determining that the United States had taken the Black Hills by duress and without paying fair market compensation. The case moved to the Court of Claims, which affirmed the finding. The government appealed. The case reached the Supreme Court in 1980. The ruling was unanimous. The court held that the Black Hills had been taken in violation of the Fifth Amendment. Justice Harry Blackmun's opinion described the history plainly, calling it a rank case of dishonorable dealing. The compensation award, with interest accumulated since 1877, was approximately $105 million. The Sioux Nation refused to accept it. The money was placed in a federal trust account. The Lakotas' position was stated by their leadership and has not changed since the ruling. They were not seeking payment for the Black Hills. They were seeking return of the land itself. The trust account remained untouched. Interest continued to accumulate. By the early 21st century, the account held over $1 billion. The Sioux Nation still refused it. The Black Hills remained in federal and private hands. The refusal of the settlement was not a negotiating posture designed to extract a larger offer. It reflected something the Supreme Court's framework was structurally unable to accommodate, the understanding that land holds a relationship to a people that a payment cannot dissolve, because the relationship is not financial in nature. Paha Sapa is where the Lakota conduct the ceremonies that have continued across everything the past 150 years produced. It is where vision quests are still undertaken, where the dead are honored, where the traditions that survived the reservation period and the boarding school era, and everything else that followed are still practiced. Accepting money for it would constitute a legal acknowledgement that the dispossession is permanent and final, that all that remains to settle is the price. Lakota leaders have said, consistently and across generations, that they are not willing to make that acknowledgement. The land is not gone, it is still there. The question of its return remains open. The reservation period that followed the dispossession reshaped Lakota life in ways that extended far beyond the loss of the hills themselves. The Great Sioux Reservation, established by the 1868 treaty, had encompassed a vast territory stretching across much of present-day South Dakota, west of the Missouri River. By 1889, that territory had been broken into 6 separate reservations through another act of Congress, the Sioux Act of 1889, which divided the unified land base and opened the surplus acres between the separate reservations to white settlement. The Lakota were pressured into signing the act under conditions that were later found to have not met the consent requirements of the 1868 treaty, a pattern repeating itself from the 1877 Black Hills Cession. The land base that remained after the 1889 division was a fraction of what the treaty had guaranteed. Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, Lower Brule, and Crow Creek became the bounded world within which Lakota life was expected to continue and reconstruct itself without the hills, without the hunting territory, and without the mobility that the Plains civilization had depended on across generations. The government's response to the reservation period was not simply to contain the Lakota geographically. It was to restructure Lakota life at its foundations, to change how children learned, how families were organized, how ceremonies were conducted, and what language was used to move through the world. The boarding school system, expanded aggressively in the 1880s and 90s, removed Lakota children from their families and transported them to institutions, sometimes hundreds of miles away, where the explicit policy was to eliminate Lakota language, dress, ceremony, and family structure. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, founded by Richard Henry Pratt, operated under a stated philosophy that was summarized in a phrase Pratt himself used: "Kill the Indian, save the man." Children who arrived speaking Lakota were prohibited from using it. Hair was cut, clothing was replaced, names were changed to English. The schools operated for decades, and their effects on the transmission of Lakota language and ceremonial knowledge across generations were severe and documented. The ceremonies that the Lakota conducted in the hills, the vision quests, the sun dance, the sweat lodge practices, were formally prohibited by the Bureau of Indian Affairs under the Religious Crimes Code, a federal policy that remained in force until 1978, when the American Indian Religious Freedom Act finally recognized the right of Native Americans to practice their traditional ceremonies. The ceremonies had continued in spite of the prohibition, carried underground by the people who understood that their continuity was not negotiable, but the suppression had cost the transmission of specific knowledge that would have moved through the community under ordinary conditions. The American Indian movement, founded in Minneapolis in 1968, brought the Black Hills claim back into national visibility. AIM organized in urban Indian communities, where the poverty and discrimination that followed from reservation conditions and urban relocation programs had concentrated. Its leaders, Dennis Banks, Russell Means, and others, connected the urban Indian experience to the treaty rights that had been violated on the reservations, and the Black Hills became one of the clearest examples of what those violations had produced. The occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973, the site where 350 Lakota men, women, and children had been killed by the 7th Cavalry in December of 1890, lasted 71 days. Federal marshals surrounded the occupiers. 2 people were killed. The occupation drew international attention to the Black Hills claim and to the conditions on Pine Ridge Reservation, which were among the most severe of any county in the United States by standard measures of poverty, unemployment, and life expectancy. The occupation did not resolve the claim. It documented the cost of its remaining unresolved. The federal presence in the Black Hills includes Mount Rushmore, completed in 1941 on a formation the Lakota call the Six Grandfathers. The sculptor Gutzon Borglum was selected for a project conceived by a South Dakota state historian named Doane Robinson, who wanted a monument that would draw tourism to the region. The site was chosen partly for its exposure to morning light. The Six Grandfathers had been a site of prayer and ceremony in the Lakota tradition before the carving began. The 4 presidents whose faces were cut into the granite include 2 who shaped the early decades of treaty-making that set the patterns followed for the next century, one under whose administration the Dakota War of 1862 was followed by the largest mass execution in American history, and one whose published statements about Native Americans left no ambiguity about how he regarded their claims to the land. Lakota activists and community members have protested at the monument across multiple generations. In 2020, Nick Tilson of the NDN Collective was arrested there during a demonstration. The Lakota position on the monument has not shifted. The National Park Service manages it. It draws approximately 2 million visitors each year. The land it stands on has never been returned. The Lakota had described what the Black Hills held long before Custer's column confirmed it. They described the gold. They described the value the hills held to any people who controlled them. And they described, in formal councils and in the written record of treaty negotiations, what removing the Lakota from Paha Sapa would mean, not just to the Lakota, but to the land itself and to the relationship between the people and the place that had been built across a longer span of time than the institutions negotiating against them could account for. Those descriptions were recorded. They are in the archives of the Office of Indian Affairs, in the proceedings of the 1875 Commission, in the testimony of Red Cloud and Spotted Tail, and the other leaders who met with government representatives and spoke without ambiguity. The record does not suggest that anyone failed to understand what the Lakota were saying. It shows the government understood and proceeded regardless, because the gold was already in the ground and the decision had already been made in the way that decisions of that kind are made, not in treaty councils but in the momentum of a thing already moving. The conditions on the Lakota reservations in the 21st century reflect the compounded effects of the dispossession and the policies that followed it across more than a century. Pine Ridge Reservation in southwestern South Dakota, situated on land that was once part of the territory guaranteed by the 1868 treaty, consistently ranks among the most economically distressed counties in the United States. Unemployment runs far above the national average. Life expectancy on Pine Ridge has been measured as among the lowest of any county in the country. The per capita income places the reservation among the most impoverished communities in North America. These are not simply the abstract conditions of general poverty. They are the specific, traceable outcomes of a documented sequence, the removal from a land base that had sustained the Lakota civilization for generations, the destruction of the buffalo herds that had been the material foundation of plains life, the confinement to bounded land that could not support the same civilization under the same terms, and the decades of policy designed to accelerate assimilation and cut the transmission of Lakota language and traditional knowledge to younger generations. The connection between the taking of the Black Hills and the conditions on Pine Ridge runs through a documented series of decisions, policies, and institutional actions across more than a century. It is not an argument that needs to be made by inference. The record holds it in full. The current status of the claim is unchanged from what it was in 1980 when the Supreme Court ruling came down. Federal legislation to restore any portion of the Black Hills to Lakota governance has been introduced in Congress multiple times without advancing. Senator Bill Bradley introduced the Sioux Nation Black Hills Act in 1985, which proposed returning approximately 1 million acres of federal land within the hills to Lakota control, while allowing the settlement money to be used for economic development. The act was supported by portions of the Lakota leadership, but was opposed by the South Dakota congressional delegation and never came to a vote. Subsequent efforts have followed a similar pattern. The Sioux Nation's refusal of the settlement money continues to this day. The trust account remains in place. The Black Hills remain in federal and private hands, managed by federal agencies including the National Park Service, the Forest Service, and the Bureau of Land Management, none of which hold the land in any arrangement that acknowledges the Lakota claim the Supreme Court confirmed was valid. The hills are still there. The legal claim is still there. The trust account is still there, uncollected. The ceremonies continue. The people who have the oldest relationship with Paha Sapa have not released their claim to it, and they have not accepted a payment for what the Supreme Court confirmed was taken from them unlawfully. The question that raises about what a promise means when the party that made it decides the cost of keeping it exceeds what it is willing to pay has not been answered. The Black Hills carry it the way granite carries everything, quietly, under the pines, in ground that has held the same question for longer than the institutions arguing over it have existed. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.